Executive Director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I'm glad that you found us either online or on TV. We will be back at the Exeter Town Hall as well as online for our next program, which will be about how Exeter residents learned about the Civil War. Not the beginning of the Civil War, but as it progressed. Historical Society trustee Caroline Seeke will present on Tuesday, March 5th at 7 p.m. Please check out our Facebook page or the events page on our website for more about our programs and activities. Thank you to Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually, especially tonight, but year-round, for which we are especially appreciative. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question, please put your question in the Q&A section if you're on Zoom, and the comments section on Facebook, and I will try and ask Barbara on your behalf. And now, for the main event, it's always a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and coworker, Barbara Rimkunas. Barbara grew up in Falmouth, Maine, and earned her BA and MA in history at the Universities of Maine and New Hampshire, respectively. In her past lives, she has worked as an archaeologist and in patient registration at the Exeter Hospital ER. Most importantly to us, she has been the curator at the Exeter Historical Society since 2000. You've probably read her historically speaking columns and/or seen her present other programs, and/or caught her in one of our over 130 Exeter History Minutes. She's pretty awesome. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Laura. I'm always glad to be introduced by my friend, Laura Martin. We're going to start by acknowledging where we are, because it's always good to know where you are. So I'm coming to you tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, which is now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Alaquakak, and Awaasak, the land, the waterways, the flora and fauna throughout the generations. Tonight's program is about the Exeter School of Nursing, which isn't called the Exeter School of Nursing. And to do this, I'm going to have to share my screen. So I'm going to start by doing that. And we'll pull up our first slide. Okay, let me know if you can see it, or let me know if you can't see it, because right now it should be there. All right, this opening screen.
It's there.
It's there. I'm so glad. Hopefully it will advance when we want it to advance and not advance when we don't want it to advance. Mm-hmm. The opening slide here features 4 young women in the class of 1930 at the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses. The women that you see here, starting with the tallest woman on the end, is Pauline Fifield, who you're going to hear me call Polly all the time, because that's how I knew her. Beatrice Mullen, Viola Stone, and Eleanor Caldwell. The story of the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses is really, in many ways, a story about nursing education. It's important to note that this is going to piggyback a little bit on a program that I did a number of years back on the Exeter Hospital. Until the 1860s, most sick people were kept at home and tended by family. Florence Nightingale was the first to make nursing a profession, as you've probably heard. And hospitals were places where sick people went to get well, and not just a place to kind of warehouse people who were ill and nobody wanted to deal with them. Nurses before Florence Nightingale were kind of outcasts from society, or they were nursing sisters. So they're either religious orders who took it on as a form of discipline, or it was people who were down on their luck and then would turn to nursing. Florence Nightingale changes all that in the 1850s and 60s when she creates it as a profession. The role of the hospital was no longer just a place for the indigent after that. especially after the germ theory was studied and it was understood that people could survive certain ailments that came across them or could survive surgery, especially when anesthesia comes in. Nurses were trained in hospital-based schools. And this allowed them to work while they were training. And you're going to see that's sort of a good things, bad things plan at the time. But it provided the hospital with some labor, and it covered the cost of training for the women who were going into the profession. The hours were long. I know a lot of nurses today still work 10, 12-hour shifts. But back then, they also worked shifts that long. So it could be a pretty tough job to have. Exeter Hospital, this is going to, like I said, it's going to cross a lot with my Exeter Hospital program. Let's see if I can get my slide to advance. It's not. Why? There we go. Here's Exeter Hospital. Exeter Hospital was founded as a cottage hospital in June of 1897. A cottage hospital is a small local community hospital. Most of the hospitals in the state of New Hampshire were formed that way, including Portsmouth Hospital, which is about 15 miles away. It was originally on Pine Street, and in 1906, the hospital moved to Prospect Hill, which is where it is still located today. And this was the first hospital building here in this photo that you see that was on Prospect Hill, the current location. And at that time in 1906, it was announced also that it would open the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses. And if I flub it up and keep calling it the Exeter Hospital Nurses Training School, it's because that name sounds just a little bit backwards, but it's Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses. The first class graduated 3 years later in 1909. It would remain a 3-year program for the whole of its existence. There were 5 women who graduated in that first class. It is important to know that the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses had very small classes. You're not going to see 20 students all coming in at one time. They're usually in groups of about 5, always under 10. Out of those 5 young women who first trained there, 3 went into private duty nursing almost immediately. 1 stayed at Exeter Hospital, and 1 went to the Franklin Hospital in Franklin, New Hampshire, where she was from. So a lot of the nurses who trained there didn't stay in hospital duty nursing. There was really a call, especially in the early part of the 20th century, for nurses to work as private duty nurses, especially in the time period when the hospital would not take care of contagious patients. And everything was contagious back then. The only vaccine that existed was smallpox. Other than that, all the other illnesses that people got, there was no protection against. So if your family got a case of diphtheria or measles or mumps, the town would then call in the health officer, and your family would be quarantined for sometimes 2 or 3 weeks if it went right through the family, as it frequently did with large families. These places would need a private duty nurse, someone to come to the house, just like doctors traveled to the patient. Frequently, nurses stayed with the patients. And so private duty nursing was a job that women could do. The tuck home for nurses, let's see if I can get here we go. The tuck home for nurses was built in 1911. This looks like it's just out in the middle of a field and there's nothing near it. But if you could see right off to the side there, not the side that's got all the wildflowers, but on the other side, the Exeter Hospital is right there. So it's right next to the hospital. The Tuck Home was funded by Edward Tuck. And he was the son of Amos Tuck. He'd become very wealthy. And anytime the town needed money for something, they usually hit up Edward Tuck. He was a philanthropist along with his wife. So this particular building provided a home for the nurses while they were in training, and it also provided some classroom space. So as you can see, it's not a very large building, but remember, if there's classes of 5 students, there's maybe 15 young women living there at the time. And it's going to be enlarged a little later on. Let's talk about Cherry Ames. I had only heard of this book peripherally, but when I brought it into the Historical Society, it seemed like nearly all women of a certain age remembered this book series. There's about 10 of them. Cherry Ames, Student Nurse, was the one I was interested in because I wanted to see how it compared to the student nurses' reminiscences about the school in Exeter. This series is kind of like the Bobbsey twins. It's a juvenile fiction, and Cherry Ames goes through student nursing, and she becomes a surgical nurse, and she becomes a military nurse, and she becomes a school nurse, and you name it, she does it throughout the, 10 or so books in the series. And always at the end, she comes up with some breakthrough treatment for something. She's always the hero. So they're a little fantastical, but they did inspire a lot of young women to go into nursing. Now, these books were written in the 1940s, which is outside of the time period we're going to be talking about, because the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses existed from 1906 until 1935. So these books were after that time period, but there are a lot of things in these books that really relate to the way that nurses were trained. Okay, so that's one of the things that I found was quite interesting. So what are the things that were similar? A lot of the rituals of life and a lot of student life are well reflected in this series of books. Student life was extremely disciplined. So once you went into nurses training, you had to obey the rules, and they could be quite strict. Students needed to be single. Because you had to live in the student nurses' residence, you couldn't be married. You couldn't be married, so you had to be single. You probably also had to be white. There were no young women of color who ever seemed to have gone through the Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses. I couldn't find any anyway. You had to be female. There were no men who were invited to participate in nurses training either. The residents had a curfew. They required long hours of hospital work. They had very strict uniform policies and, decorum. You had to behave yourself. In exchange for this, however, there was no tuition. So you didn't walk out with student loans. No tuition. Students received room and board and laundry services. They had to pay for their own uniforms, stockings, and shoes, but they did receive a small stipend. Now, I don't know what it was at the beginning of the school's existence, but I know that by 1930, it was $20 a month for the first year and a half that you worked there. And then it was $25 a month for the second year and a half. And you also could pick up some extra money when you were out on affiliation, which I'll talk about a little more in a few minutes. Students did have to pay for their books, and they also had to pay for any breakage. Now, one of the primary sources I have for the School of Nursing at all is through a young Pauline Fifield, later Pauline Fifield Kennick, who you saw in that first slide. She was the tall student standing at one end. Pauline just left us her reminiscences through the efforts of her daughter, Lois Kennick. They did a lot of work on this back in 2006 when we'll talk about that later too, when the hospital begins to create a history wall for the School of Nursing. Pauline says that you had to pay for any breakage. This could be broken thermometers, or she said this it's such a specific thing, or if you overboil infant nipples for their bottles, which sounds like something that could have really happened possibly to her. You had to pay for that. So you did have to be cautious about what you were using and the equipment that you were using. So she said there wasn't usually much left over, but it was also during the Great Depression. And so, nobody had a lot of money, and she appreciated that. Here's Pauline, and she is wearing her probationary uniform. If you read Cherry Ames' Student Nurse, you would know that the first thing that happens when you enter nursing school at this time period is you became a probationary student. This only lasted a few months, maybe 4 months is what Pauline remembered. In Cherry Ames, it's practically 2 months. But during this time period, you were probationary. They haven't even officially accepted you into the school. So what Pauline is wearing here is just a light dress, kind of a sack dress, long sleeves, and a regular apron. There's no bib on it. It's not a very formal looking uniform. And always black stockings and black shoes. She's posing here at her home. She hasn't even got to Exeter yet. It looks like she's standing in a cornfield, but I believe she was from Nashua. That was the original uniform. And here you can see the entire probationary class from 1930. There's Pauline, or Polly, on the end. Next to her is Beatrice Mullen, who you'll see in other pictures. Next to her is Eleanor Caldwell, and Lois Taylor, and Viola Stone. You can see the nurses here are from many different towns, New Hampshire and Massachusetts. None of them are from Exeter. The school generally tried not to recruit students from Exeter. So if you're expecting to see a large group of young women going from the Robinson Female Seminary in Exeter and going right into nursing training at the Exeter Hospital, you didn't see that. The reason for that was it was decided that they would know the patients too well because they grew up with them. So they tried to recruit people from other places. There's a big recruitment program trying to recruit young women from Nova Scotia. I'm not sure what the lure was, but they decided that that was a place to recruit. So there's a number of students who came from Nova Scotia. So here they all are in their probationary uniforms. The next step up after you served about 3 or 4 months, you went through an unofficial capping ceremony. You'd get your cap. I'll show you that in a moment. And you would get your official student uniform. This was the student uniform: short sleeves, white cuffs, white collar, apron. This is starched within an inch of its life, by the way. It almost feels like it's heavy cardstock when you touch it. The bib overalls, in the back, they fastened together, and you could actually slide your bandage scissors into the back belt of this uniform. This is one of Polly's uniforms. She saved it and she donated it to the Exeter Historical Society. So we have this. And here's her roommate. This is Beatrice Mullen, who is modeling it for you. You can see black shoes, black stockings. And Polly also wanted to mention that there are other aspects of this uniform. She's wearing her cap, which hopefully you can see. And she has a bar pin that connected the top collar. And some of it was held together just with straight pins. There's Polly and Beatrice. Or Betty. I'm sorry. I can't see my own captions. So this is after capping. Here are the nurses' caps. These are the Exeter used the traditional caps. There's all sorts of nursing caps. You can go down a rabbit hole looking at nursing uniform caps. There's little fluffy ones that sit on the top of the head. There's some that looks like a little pill box. These were the most common ones in the United States. The one that you see that's all white was the student nurse's cap. And it meant that she was officially a student nurse, but she was not yet a registered nurse. The one next to it, which has a ribbon on it, was the nursing cap that you would have after graduation. And there was another ceremony for getting your ribbon on your cap. My husband is a nurse, and when he went through nursing school, they had a capping ceremony, but he didn't get a cap. It was 1986. There were, I think, 3 men in his graduating class, might have been 4. He's probably not watching, but if he was, he'd correct me. And they didn't give him a cap because he was a man, but they did give him the ribbon, which I believe we have lost. But anyway, these are the nursing caps. And it was a big deal. As you moved through the steps of becoming a nurse, you became more and more professional as you moved along. So it was a big deal. And that comes out if you like to read Cherry Ames. She talks about how important it is. Here's Polly once she is a fully registered nurse. At this point, she would have completed her training at the training school. So she'd gotten her diploma, which would have meant she would have gotten her official cap. She would have gotten pinned. There's a pinning ceremony as well. Most nurses receive a pin from the place that they do their nurses training. And then she would have had to sit for her nursing boards. Nursing boards are usually taken during the summer after one graduates. And back when Mike took them, I think he took it in July, and then he had to wait months to get the results to find out. So there's this time period between when you graduate from the program and when you actually find out if you've passed your nursing boards. Now, hospitals are eager to hire nurses always. And so you generally will get hired during that time period, and you're called a graduate nurse, or today's parlance, it might be has a different name now. I can't remember what Mike talked about. So I was curious to find out what nurses training is like today to compare it. So I contacted not a former student of mine, but one of the students who was one of my Girl Scouts in my Girl Scout troop, Liz Corey. So Liz just graduated from nursing training, and I asked her about things like uniforms and pinning ceremonies. And here's some of the things that she shared with me when I talked to her yesterday through texting. Liz says that when she finished her nurses training, she took her boards about 2 months later, same as my husband did, except that Liz did it online, and she knew the very next day that she was an RN. She also, like Mike, went through a 4-year program. Today, the American Nurses Association encourages all people who are going into the profession of a registered nurse to do a 4-year course. You used to be able to do a 3-year diploma course and then get your RN. Today, they want as much as possible for people to take the BSN, the Bachelor of Science Nursing course of action. It's just, it's so much more complicated. Medical treatment today is more complex, and so you need that. So that's what Liz did. She said I asked her about uniforms. She said nurses don't wear caps anymore, as we know. Most nurses stopped wearing caps long ago. They're a little bit unsanitary because they sit on your head. They take a lot of special treatment. You have to care for them in certain ways. They're hard to keep on your head when you're really moving. The interesting thing is that unless you're an OR nurse or trauma nurse, they sometimes wear caps. Well, OR nurses certainly do. But if you are, during COVID, a lot of nurses went back to wearing caps, but they were more like the scrub caps that you see. Nurses no longer wear white uniforms anymore either, which everyone seems happy about. Mike started out having to wear white uniforms. They're hard to keep clean. They're frequently hard to wash. And so almost everybody in the hospital now wears scrubs, which are probably a lot better for everyone except the patient, who can be a little confused. But now they all wear lanyards that tell you that they are nurses. And if you're ever confused as to who somebody is at the hospital, you can just ask them, and they will let you know what their role is. Liz told me that as a student nurse, they were supposed to wear the colors of their school. She went to the University of Southern Maine, as did Mike. And the school colors at that time were navy and white. And she said, but hardly ever did people wear white. They usually wore navy. They're just much easier. And then she went into very specifics about how, well, they're very strict on some things, but they've really lightened up lately on piercings and tattoos, which was not an issue at all when my husband was in nursing school in the 1980s. She said they're pretty relaxed about tattoos as long as they are appropriate. You can't have facial piercings of any kind, but gone are the days like when Pauline would have gone to nursing school when you couldn't wear any jewelry whatsoever. So that's some of the changes that you see. She said they do sometimes tolerate the little nose rings on the side. Kind of interesting thoughts about that. So this photo was taken from the nurses training school towards the Exeter Hospital. So you're looking at Exeter Hospital, and it is described in the collection of photos, which came to us from Pauline Fifield-Kennick, and it's called Morning Hours, Doctor's Visits. So what you're seeing is a collection of cars for the doctors who would come into the hospital in the morning to check on their patients before they had to open their clinics or start their rounds. And they all have cars. It was very important for doctors to be mobile back in the day, which is why during World War II, doctors had a larger allotment of gasoline than many people did during rationing. Let's talk about one of the training school's stellar students, and that would be Sarah Nickel. Sarah Nichol was from Nova Scotia. She was one of the women who was recruited from Nova Scotia. And she was actually 29 years old when she came to the school in 1917. What she was doing before that, I have no idea. But she came in to Exeter and convinced them that even at 29, she wanted to enroll in the School of Nursing. And she excelled. She whipped through her 3 years of education there, and she graduated in 1920. And then she stayed on. She started as a duty nurse. Then she quickly became head nurse, supervisor, assistant superintendent, and finally superintendent of the hospital. The superintendent of the hospital ran the hospital. She was in charge of nearly everything that happened at the hospital. And in fact, she was also in charge of the nurses training school. So she had been in the nurses training school 5 years earlier, and then she's running it. So she was a pretty remarkable woman. Nancy Merrill described her as someone who knew the size of every light bulb and every socket in the building. She stayed until 1957. And it's hard to find anybody who said anything bad about her. She wasn't some difficult, strict battle axe. She was very demanding of her student nurses, but she would also give them time off. She'd let them leave the building, the nurses' home early on a hot summer night so they could run down the hill and get some ice cream at Higgins Ice Cream. So she wasn't entirely terrible. She ran the hospital. So she was a very remarkable person. When she retired in 1957, the trustees of the hospital granted her a permanent salary for the rest of her life. And she promptly went back to Nova Scotia. This is Dr. Newt. I apologize for the quality of this photo. Dr. Newt was a physician and lecturer at the Exeter Training School for Nurses. He was also the head of Exeter Hospital for many years and was part of the medical staff. He was involved in a lot of the teaching and training. And I want to share with you just some of the things that nursing students learned at that time period, because today nursing training is quite rigorous. You have to have a very strong science background. So if you're good in science and mathematics, particularly biological sciences, nursing could be the job for you. In 1909, when they graduated their first class, they would have local doctors come in and give special lectures on certain topics. So Dr. Otis came and talked about the care of tuberculosis patients. Dr. Mannix talked about infectious diseases. Dr. Newt, this gentleman you see here, was teaching anatomy, sepsis, asepsis, and OR techniques. He had a lot on his plate. Dr. Tuttle taught anesthetics and care of patients before and after. Dr. Day taught about fractures and emergencies. Dr. Keniston went over obstetrics and the care of the child in health and disease. Dr. Knowlton, who must have been the laboratory person, talked about urinalysis and bacteriology. Dr. Chesley talked about hygiene. She also did some work in psychiatric nursing a little later on. And they had Miss Smith, who came in from another school, who taught them about reading aloud, proper diction. Miss Annie Dick came in and taught massage. And the Boston Cooking School sent people in to teach the nurses dietetics and cooking lessons. If you were going to be a private duty nurse, you were going to need to prepare food for your patients. So that was very important. They had weekly classes and demonstrations from October 1st until June 30th. There were 5 textbooks required during the 1909 year. They had a textbook of nursing. They had anatomy and physiology, fever nursing, obstetrics, and something called materia medica, which today we would probably call pharmacology. That is a big class in nursing school even today. By 1930, things had changed a lot. As I said before, medicine and nursing had become more complex. There was a lot more to it. Dr. Otis was still teaching the basics of tuberculosis. Dr. Newt was now teaching anatomy, bandaging, emergencies, gynecology, materia medica, and OR technique. Dr. Knowlton was teaching bacteriology. Dr. Chesley was still on staff, hygiene and psychiatric nursing. Dr. Colby taught pediatrics, and Dr. Gilbert was teaching obstetrics and urinalysis. There were now about 15 textbooks. So there was a lot more reading, a lot more reference materials. I mean, the balance in that is if you are just going to lectures and writing notes like you were in 1909, if you wanted to refer back, if you wanted to try and rack your brain for something, you'd have to try and remember it all. By the time you get to 1930, which is when Pauline Highfield was coming in with her classmates, you had reference materials. You could go back and look things up. And so the books were wide ranging. There would be a whole book on bandaging, a whole book on dietetics, a whole book on ethics, which they hadn't had before. So there was a lot more to it. They even did a history of nursing at that point in time. I highly applaud that. Students also by the mid-20s, I think, the hospital obviously couldn't teach them everything. They just didn't have enough patients. Your average daily census might be 45 patients, maybe, and sometimes it was a lot less than that. And so without enough patients for the variety of cases that they may see, they sent students out to do what they called affiliations. When you were on affiliation, you were at a different institution, and you stayed there, and they were required to feed and house you while you were there. And there were 3 or 4 different places they could go. Okay, here's Polly and Beatrice and Dr. Chesley. Dr. Chesley is something of a legend in the town of Exeter. There were very few women who were doctors at that time period. Dr. Chesley was one. She was also on staff at the Robinson Seminary, and she was also tended to students at the University of New Hampshire up in Durham. So she was a busy woman. She did a lot of teaching. Most of the time, the nurses stayed in the hospital. I said they went on affiliation, and we'll get to that in a moment. This is a really odd photo. I've tried to make sense of it. It is labeled in the books, setting up the OR, and it does appear to be the side of Exeter Hospital. You can see the nurses in the very window there at the end, and that could be the OR. It could be. I'm saying could because you need a lot of light in an OR. Perhaps that's why there's such a large window, but it's a hard picture to understand. And here's the nurse's home after its expansion. They added a whole second side to it. The top that you see there with the 3 dormers coming out is where the nurses who were on night shift used to sleep. This is a publicity photo called Night Duty. And you can see it seems like it's very quiet. These are both registered nurses. Neither of these are students, but you can see in the quiet hours at night, they are getting some knitting done, maybe doing a little reading. But they were there from 7 p.m. till 7 a.m. So that's a long time. And this is one of Polly's classmates. She is getting ready for sleep, according to the caption that was on there. She's wearing her fuzzy slippers and she's getting ready to sleep in the top floor of the nurse's home. It's a great picture. Here's a duty nurse. This is another publicity shot, but here's another duty nurse at Exeter Hospital. This is sometime after the electric call system was installed in the 1920s. So they finally had access to all the patient rooms. Now, to talk about affiliation studies, this is Polly Fifield with a young charge, little Freddie, while she was working at a place called the Balch Memorial Hospital for Children in Manchester, New Hampshire, a place I had a lot of difficulty trying to figure out. Most of what I know about it, it was a children's hospital, it was private, so that makes it unusual. One of the things I know about it the most is how much Polly disliked it, because the Balch Hospital, she was always hungry. She said they didn't feed the student nurses properly. If you were on day shift, they would at least provide you with breakfast and another meal. If you were on night shift, they might not do that at all. And she hated it so much, not the work so much. And this little boy was in because he had clubbed feet, something we hardly ever see anymore. It's caused by a vitamin deficiency. And everybody was quite fond of little Freddie, according to what she said. But she was glad to get away from the Balch. It seems to have rolled itself into Elliott Hospital today, where there's a wing called the Balch Wing. Here's her certificate. from the Balch Memorial Hospital for Children in Manchester. It was on Myrtle Street. It's been torn down. So if you're from Manchester and you're trying to figure out where it was, it's not there anymore. And it was med surg and orthopedic care of infants and children. Like they didn't have a category then for pediatrics, I guess. She then went to the New Hampshire State Hospital, and she did some time up there as well with psychiatric nursing. She didn't really have much to say about this. I guess it was a better situation. She also did an affiliation. Today, you'd call that clinical studies. Nursing students today would just call it clinical. At the Boston City Hospital School of Nursing in contagious diseases. Remember, I mentioned that contagious diseases were just that. There was not much they could do about it. This is before antibiotics. And so there was not much treatment for many things. And sometimes the students themselves became quite ill. There was a diphtheria inoculation at this point in time. Several nurses became ill. Viola, one of the students that you saw there, a classmate of Polly, who contracted diphtheria while she was in Boston, and she had to stay in the isolation ward until it was safe for her to leave. Polly tells this rather funny story about the fact that when it was time for her to finally leave the isolation ward, they would burn all your possessions to prevent you from transferring any of that to anybody else. And this particular nurse, Viola, had a book that had been given to her by her fiance, and she didn't want it burned. And so she tossed it out the window to Polly and another friend while they were in Boston, and they smuggled it out. Annie Kucharski also fell ill while she was in Boston and was very indignant when Miss Nickel back in Exeter sent her a copy of Little Women to pass the time. So the book's a bit of a downer at times. I think that's what she was thinking. This plaque was somewhere in Exeter Hospital for many, many years. It lists all 91 of the young women who studied at the Exeter Hospital Training School. And I went out to Exeter Hospital this morning to see if I could find it anywhere, and I couldn't locate it anywhere. This picture was taken by Lois Kennick back in 2006, but I can't find it. So it's got to be around somewhere. Does not mean these women are forgotten, but it's missing. The school itself closed. I should go back to that previous slide. Oh, here we go. All right. We'll stay here for a second. The school closed in 1935. And it didn't close because they didn't have enough students. They still had enough students. The reason that it closed, according to what the Exeter Hospital's Board of Trustees said, was that they could no longer... What did they say? They said it was forced upon us by the exacting requirements for registration in the larger states where many of our nurses must seek employment, requirements which are meant to remove from competition graduates of small hospitals. What that means is that Exeter didn't have the wide array of classes that were required for students in other states or to meet state standards. Training for nurses had changed over the years. And so Exeter Hospital's training school closed right after, a couple of years after the Portsmouth Hospital training school closed. So they were following along with what was going on in Portsmouth. Rather than have hospital-based schools of nursing, you would either go to a much larger hospital, someplace like City Hospital in Boston, or someplace in Manchester, some larger state entity, or you would start going to more of a college program. As the requirements expanded, it was found that Exeter was going to have to send their students out more and more for more training. So they closed it in 1935, I think with the intention of thinking maybe they'll reopen it again. But after that, what happens is World War II happens. Women who went into nursing, if they weren't nurses already, they could get nursing training through the military, through the Army or the Navy. There was one student, there was two students who served in World War II from the Exeter Hospital Training School. And there was one young woman who served in World War I. She was in the Canadian forces, though. And there was one student nurse who died during the 1918 flu epidemic. Quite a few of the nurses came down with flu during 1918, including Sarah Nickel. Most of them, however, except one, survived. So with the expansion of nursing through the military, there was thought that once the war is over, there will be this vast supply of nurses who will come home and they will fill all of these empty slots because the hospitals really needed them. The baby boom hits right after that. There's a lot of call for nursing. It didn't work out that way, though. A lot of the women who went off to war came home, just wanted to forget about their service. They didn't stick with nursing, or they didn't feel the need to, and they didn't stay in it. This becomes a problem as we go along. So does nursing education end in 1935 in Exeter? You already got a hint to this because I ran ahead on my slide. But it didn't. I was surprised to find out just last year that there was a program of licensed practical nursing that also came to Exeter. A licensed practical nurse different from an RN. All levels of nursing are important to the medical field today. We need all levels of nursing. Licensed practical nurses took on a lot of what we would today call patient care. They did a lot of the feeding, ambulating, dressing changes, all of the practical work that needed to be done. The program generally was a 2-year program, and the state of New Hampshire really pushed to have licensed practical nursing become a vocation that women could go into. And one of the things that they did was they opened it up to anyone between the ages of 18 and 50 could start their training. Both through the program that was kind of started in Exeter. It wasn't only an Exeter program. They called it the Exeter School of Practical Nursing, but it was only called that from 1960 to 1965. It was in coordination with Wentworth Douglas Hospital in Dover and what was called the Portsmouth Vocational Technical Institute, which today has turned itself into, I think, Great Bay Community College. Practical nurses did a 2-year course with some on-site training, and they were the workhorses of many hospitals. Today, they are not usually found in hospitals. You more are likely to find LPNs working at long-term care facilities. They work in physicians' offices. They do a variety of work throughout the nursing field. So still a good field to get into. There is another level of there's a number of levels of nursing. If you can't do a 2-year associate's program, like an LPN program, there's also CNA training, which is certified nurses aides, or as they're called in New Hampshire, it's I think it's LPNs or LNAs, licensed nursing assistants, who are also covered by nursing, and they take a certification course and a number of hours that they do training. And then above the RNs, above the registered nurses, you can go into nurse practitioner levels, nurse midwives, nurse anesthetists. Those are your mid-levels. They have the equivalents of master's degrees. And then there's Doctor of Nursing programs who do primarily education. There's many different levels of nursing out there. Exeter Hospital also had a program run by the Red Cross they were called the Gray Ladies. Similar to what a CNA might do today, they assisted with things like that this woman is doing here, where she is helping assist a patient eating. So they were also there. The Nurses Training School, the training school for nurses, had a very active alumni association from its closure in 1935 until the late 1950s. Here are two of the last women who were in the alumni association: Annie Kucharski, class of 1935, and Polly Fifield-Kennick, class of 1933. And they're visiting together here in 2006. In 2006, Polly and her daughter Lois decided that they were going to kind of push Exeter Hospital to acknowledge the women who were involved in this school. Now, the hospital had already done that. Somewhere in the hospital is that plaque, right? It's somewhere. It's probably still there. It's just not on display at the moment. And so they had already named the the road that goes around the hospital today, I think sometime in the 1990s or the late 80s, they had named that road Alumni Drive. But they named it Alumni Drive, ALUMNI, which is a masculine, although it can mean either gender. And that always just bugged Polly and Lois that they named it that way. But in 2006, they started pushing to see if they could acknowledge the nurses in some other way. Here is Polly for the unveiling of the history wall that now is on display at Exeter Hospital, right across from the gift shop, if you're ever up on the 3rd floor. And she was there to unveil. She's in her 90s in this photo. The Exeter Hospital Training School for Nurses also became part of the Women's Heritage Trail in the state of New Hampshire. And they righted a great wrong a number of years later by naming the entryway to the hospital Alumni Plaza with the correct Latin affixed to it. It's okay to say alumni. It does mean men or women, but there were no men who ever attended this school. And so it really did need to be changed. I need to thank, first of all, the families of Pauline and Lois Kennick. They got this project started many years ago, and it was delightful to work with them over the years. I got to help a little bit with the history wall. I was there for the unveiling. It was wonderful to get to know both Lois and especially Pauline. She had so many great stories to tell. I also want to thank my husband, Mike Nickerson, who is a nurse, who gave me a lot of advice on various bits of nursing history and the levels of nursing. And a big thank you to Liz Corey, Exeter High School class of 2017, had to do all of her nursing training, most of her nursing training during the pandemic. And she will have some stories to tell someday. She currently works as a labor and delivery nurse in Maine. And she's quite happy doing that and was, like I said, one of my Girl Scouts. And she was very happy to talk with me about nursing. I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. We have 15 minutes here. And I think Laura is going to try and field those for me. We'll see what we can do.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, excellent. So we actually have the director of the nursing program at GBCC on the call.
Wonderful.
And she wanted to point out that graduate nurses, she has a few things to say. So graduate nurses can apply for a temporary nurse license, and boards are called licensing exams.
Okay.
And then she just wanted to stress that it is perfectly reasonable to do a 2-year ASN program. And when you were initially talking about the BSN, moving towards the 4-year, she wanted to say, please don't reinforce the stereotype that only a 4-year BSN can be a nurse. She said that 2/3 of our students are in a second career and are more mature and have life and leadership experience. And then half have another degree as well. So she just wanted to point that out. That's Dulcinea Kaufman.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, nurses are needed on all levels. So definitely, in fact, my husband had nothing but great things to say about every LPN I think he's ever worked with over the years. The differences are in the types of duties that different nurses have. And you could kind of simplify it by saying that registered nurses create care plans and LPNs work under the supervision of registered nurses most of the time. And I hope she might correct me if I have that wrong. Remember, I'm not a nurse. I'm getting my information secondhand from my husband. So she does say we are an RN program. Okay.
And then she also says, really interesting presentation, great use of historical pictures.
Oh, thank you.
So, additionally, we have a couple of other questions from Jackie Gendron. Do you know how they recruited students in Nova Scotia and elsewhere?
I know that other schools recruited in the Exeter area by putting advertisements in the newspaper. And so it would say for more information, write to. Pauline said that when she was looking for a nursing program to be involved in, she shopped around to find one that would support her as much entirely as she could. She wanted to be independent financially from the rest of her family. So she was looking for a program that she would be able to manage the money for it. So I have a feeling that financial incentives had something to do with it.
Okay. And her other question is, so what's with the candy striper thing?
I am not a nurse, but I thought it would be fun to put on my candy striper uniform from not circa, exactly, 1976, 1977. I was a candy striper at the Mercy Hospital in Portland, Maine, and I did my candy striper training at the Mercy Hospital School of Nursing, where they taught us how to feed patients, how to make a proper nursing bed, how to calculate I's and O's, that's intakes and outputs. What they didn't teach us, but what we also did, was buy cigarettes for the patients and pick up newspapers for them.
Okay. We do not currently have any other questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A now if you're on Zoom, or into the comments on Facebook right now, and Barbara can answer them. So in the meantime, would you like to speak about anything else, Barbara?
I will say that when I was a candy striper, which, as I mentioned, was a long, long time ago, the person that I worked most directly with on the wards at Mercy Hospital was a position known as a ward aide, and that was a person who was I believe she was an LPN, and she was wonderful. She just helped us to really understand the importance of what we were doing and how to best help the patients, because we were kids. I mean, we were 13 and 14 years old, had no idea. We were seeing past our own noses was sometimes very tricky. She was wonderful. And I remember that she worked closely with the RNs on staff. RNs, as I said, wrote up care plans. They were the ones who directed what was going to happen with the patients. The LPNs were the people that actually did a lot of the work. No matter how I say it, it's going to sound like I'm dissing some level of nursing. I don't mean to.
Well,
but I was surprised years later to find that LPNs were moved out of the hospital setting, and it was mostly RNs that you were seeing within the hospital setting.
And David Wakefield asks, are there still candy stripers?
They're called teenage hospital volunteers. I don't know if they do them at Exeter Hospital. There's so many more restrictive privacy laws today than there were in the 1970s. I don't remember them ever going over patient confidentiality with us at all. And I think they're much more cautious about that today. If there is a program like that today, I imagine it would be a lot different from the way it was when I was there.
All right, we have a question from Beth Diamond. Were the students primarily single women, or were there married women in the program?
There were no married women in the program. And I didn't see it written down that was a requirement. I have a feeling that it was something that it was you just did not go into a program like this if you were married at the time. Remember, there were a lot of limitations. There were some places that wouldn't hire a nurse, an RN, somebody who had already gone through the entire program, if they were married. So when you look through the list of students who went through the Exeter Hospital program, there are a number of them who got all of their nurses training, and then as soon as they walked out, they got married and they never went into nursing. They got all the training done, but they never did it. Now, some of those women may have occasionally worked as sort of unofficial private duty nurses. So they may have picked up some work on the side while they were married, but some of them just did not see it as the profession that it was. Most of the others did, of course, and I don't have the breakdown of how many people stayed with it and how many didn't. You could work, usually you could get hired as a nurse if you were married, if you were working in a physician's office or other places. Polly worked at Lamont Infirmary over at Phillips Exeter Academy for most of her nursing career, and she did some district nursing within the town. So there were other options. The thing about nursing is it's a very broad field. If you have the training, you can. There's just a wide scope of different types of nursing. You really don't need to ever get bored. You can just switch from one type of nursing to another. You can start out on the floors at the hospital, or you can do that your whole life. You can work as a school nurse, which is not a simple job. There's just all different types of nursing. Could be in the OR. You could be, it's just nurses everywhere. Prison nurses, they're all over the place.
And kind of on that note, Melissa Dunn says many hospitals are taking LPNs again.
Yay!
And she also said very interesting.
Thanks. That's encouraging to hear.
All right, that appears to be it. So thank you, Barbara.
I was glad to be here.
All right. We hope that you will join us next month to hear about newspapers and the Civil War. And in the meantime, check out our history minutes and Barbara's historically speaking columns that are in the Exeter newsletter, as well as online when I get them up. That's on me. Although you can Google them and find them there as well. So we hope to see you soon. Janet Sullivan says, thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.